All right. Good morning, everybody. It's good to hear from some folks and see some of you. It's a little bit of a different presentation I want to provide today that follows, I would say, is an unprecedented event and in the life of OSU Wheat Improvement here. This was not something that it was not our intent, of course, to come out with 5 wheat varieties at one time. It's more a matter of the structure of the program and how that has evolved over the last 20 something years. So today I'm not going to talk too much about the varieties themselves, but more about the process. So you're really going to get an under the hood look and hear about this what are some of the things I think about. So you'll hear some commentary, that's for certain, but a little bit less about the varieties themselves. So just 3 things. I like to divide the presentation up in 3 ways as best I can. And we're going to talk about pipelines in the program, some of the mechanics, and Dr. Brzezowski has already done a really good job of talking mechanics. So I'll just build off that. And then some quality matters. So to bring everybody up to speed, these are the 5 varieties that were released in 2020. This is after a not so eventful year in 19. We had OK Corral, but a very big year in 18 and also in 17. Now, just to summarize real quick, each one of these varieties have some characteristics that we really wanted to feature and to have available to our wheat producers in some part of the state, not necessarily the entire state. So you see those on the right. I won't go into that very much, but I will say, you think about this, and I'm always asked this question: why can't you just combine these varieties or combine the traits into one variety? Well, I mean, look at this. We really wouldn't want to have a Clearfield variety for the Panhandle with wheat streak mosaic resistance or BYD resistance for that matter necessarily. In a spring wheat background. These are all very different approaches to breeding, and therefore very different outcomes that can be used in different ways. So what's really going on in this program is the development of pipelines. And a breeding pipeline is not a trait. It's not a Clearfield trait. It's not coaxium. It's not even quality. A trait traverses several pipelines. And I like to think of a pipeline being defined by how we just go about the breeding and how do we select, not necessarily how we test, but how we select. And that relates to the breeding method, also where the breeding takes place, beyond, of course, the crossing. And then also the environment selection. This is very important to how the breeding method is carried out. And we are very much targeted in that environmental selection, as you'll soon learn. And of course, root germplasm. What is feeding the pipeline? Different pipelines are fed by different kinds of germplasm to achieve, again, certain outcomes. So all we're trying to do with these pipelines is increase the probability of reaching the desired outcomes, but also have choices available to the producer. And this is something I have really struggled with mentally over the years is, do I make that choice as breeder here at OSU, or do we allow the producer, who I think is oftentimes more capable of making a more intelligent choice? And while that really came to fruition with the release of Gallagher and Iba, had the choice been up to the breeder, we would have only released Iba. If we had to choose one or the other, it would have been Iba. What a mistake that would have been. And I can think of other situations. So a little bit of history first. I took over the variety development program after being here already in a research and teaching position, basically in quantitative genetics. So I had a chance to really learn about wheat breeding and some of the options that might be available. The pipeline that was in place, and there really was one single pipeline prior to 1998, and that was directed by Dr. Ed Smith, my predecessor. What's really important is breeding, how you manage your germplasm early in the breeding cycle. So we'll talk a little bit about this, but just to briefly say, the way Dr. Smith managed those early generations was really get through those generations as fast as possible so he could work with lines. And so there wasn't really a lot of selection going on during those early generations. It was still water focused, if anything, which I've kind of find out that's probably not the best place to develop lines for breeding. And then his lineage was very much influenced by Triumph, although he was transitioning over to a Pioneer germplasm base when he retired. About one variety in 3 years was the goal at that time. So, wow, things have changed, right? In 1998, again, I had the opportunity prior to that time to play around and test with a different kind of breeding approach. And that is where we're targeting varieties that are specifically adapted to a grazed situation, but also if they are not grazed, they can do very well. And this is a tough call. It wasn't very easy to do, but I think that the critical part is right here. If I can show them with my pointer, this is the breeding cycle shown in a circle. The first 4 years are devoted to population development, where we're using animals. We're using actual cattle to select the lines. And this was never done before 1998. But a critical piece of this grazing grain breeding method. Lines then would be developed from these populations using simulated grazing, basically a mowing operation. And then we would go into line testing. And so you see the number of years involved in each one of these phases. These phases are pretty much common to any pure line development program, except with double haploids, of course. This pipeline has been in place since 1998. This is where the selection really occurs. This is where the dirty work gets done. It's not so much over here. Genes are fixed. We're pretty much limited by what's at the table. You know, we're working with about 400 lines every year, give or take, in testing, but we're working with thousands of genetic possibilities over here. So we want to make sure we come to the table for testing with the best genetic combinations available. We do that by modifying the way we conduct selection in those first two phases. All right, parallel to that, Dr. Art Klatt came on board, I think it was 1999, 2000, in that time frame, and introduced another pipeline. And these two pipelines really ran parallel to one another, and we fed off each other. But the pipeline directed by Dr. Klatt, and I think we may have one of his former students on the Zoom today, Sarah McNeil, who knows this breeding procedure very well and still practices it today with Syngenta. He used a different selection method where he focused on minor gene resistance. In other words, those genes that have small effects to diseases, primarily leaf rust. But stripe rust came on board after 2000, and that really broadened the focus. The focus was on the central corridor, not so much the panhandle, the high plains, and the germplasm that fed this program was highly influenced by cement. So a very, very different pipeline, and it was in operation up until the time he retired. This pipeline not only serviced our breeding program, but breeding programs throughout the Southern Great Plains. So what do we have today? Well, this is it, pretty much. I am looking at some other pipelines and testing parts of those to see how we might be able to develop them into real pipelines. But right now, we have 5 in place. Of course, the Klatt minor gene resistance pipeline is coming to a close. We're taking that germplasm and feeding into the other 4 pipelines. So let me just describe some of the things about these. And you see the names, some of the main characteristics of these pipelines, where we are positioning germplasm to come out of those. So the grazing grain, which is the primary pipeline, but it is perhaps losing a little bit of emphasis in favor of some of these others at the current time. We're targeting, of course, across the Southern Plains, all systems, but we want definite adaptation to a dual purpose graze system. With double haploids, accelerated breeding, we're again targeting the southern plains, but probably only a grain-only system. But if we get lucky, we may have something that's adapted to dual-purpose management. And this high plains, and you really haven't heard much about this, but you're going to. We're targeting western Oklahoma because it took me over 20 years to realize that it's hard to breed wheat out of Stillwater, America, for the panhandle of Oklahoma. It's just not the way to go about it. And I finally gave in and said, okay, we're going to set up a pipeline. We're actually going to move a part of the program virtually to the panhandle. And that's where we're going to conduct our operations. Pedigree selection, where we really go after yield. Of course, not forgetting about quality. We're usually using markers in this situation, but not necessarily. This is something you're going to hear more about. And then the genetics, very quickly, we might be working with a very broad genetic pool for the grazing grain, but a much more narrow pool for the double haploids, simply because double haploids, we spend our money better and more efficiently with a higher elite base germplasm. Of course, we're more restricted with high plains. We're restricted with pedigree selection, where we're going after that yield. And then the Klatt pipeline was extremely broad. The amount of time spent in a breeding cycle is pretty consistent, although we can now shave off several years with double haploids. So you see the big difference here. And I want to talk about this a little bit more because it plays into some of the decisions being made today. As far as the varieties, how they relate to a pipeline, 2020, we had 4 of the pipelines featured. Big Country, and I think Lane mentioned an experimental in his study that ended with 6W. That came straight out of the Klatt pipeline. We have had many candidates come out of that pipeline. We've even put them under foundation seed increase, but never pulled the trigger on them. We finally pulled the trigger on this one. But you see how we have now covered the pipelines, except the high plains. 19 was OK Corral, the grazing grain. We had 18 Spirit Rider, Smith's Gold, and Lone Rider. Those pipelines and everything came out of the grazing grain pipeline in 17. So I did mention these 3, that these are really the up and coming Josh Wards of the breeding program. I am really excited about what we can do with all 3 of these. I see the potential already. You're going to see products in terms of release varieties coming out of all 3 of those in the middle. In fact, you can see how the breeding program is positioned in Goodwell, Oklahoma. We have every possible feature at this station, at the OPREC station at Goodwell. You can even see the head rows over here to the right, where we have head row selection going on there. So every generation is featured, of course, except for the F1. We keep that in Stillwater. All right, so moving forward, what really determines variety output is the productivity of a pipeline. We're not looking for something every year from every pipeline, but we are looking for productivity. And if we have it, we're going to make it commercially available. And yes, we are thinking about a new pipeline related to kind of like the Butler's Gold kind of adaptation, where you can plant something really late. We call it a short season variety. This takes a very different breeding method than what we're currently using. The opposite breeding method, in fact, to the grazing grain, what's used in the grazing grain procedure. This is really interesting. The number of crosses that service our program really has not changed in the last 10 years. So we're making about, anywhere from 900 to 1,100 crosses every year. Our load is in fact, we're actually going to make a few less crosses this coming year. I think we're getting more bang for our crossing buck. We know where we can get the best results if we plan those hybridizations properly. And with markers, I think we can even do better, but we're not able to use that to the extent I like to at this time. My concern is not how many releases right now. It's more about how much time it takes. So let me talk about that a little bit. I want to talk about the years of replicated statewide yield trials that we spend before release. Now, this is not the first two phases of the breeding cycle where we're talking about population development or line development. This is just strictly testing. And in textbook terms, you want to spend at least 2 years and maybe up to 5 years. I would never, well, I better not say never, because it's possible with coaxium. We may just go with a 2-year testing protocol. But over the years, we have averaged 6 years of statewide yield trials. So, even though we've had a lot of releases, they've certainly not been quick ones. And now you can see in this table the number of years we tested each one of these varieties before we actually released them. As many as 9 for Strat and Big Country, as few as 3 for the double haploid uncharted. So that was a really quick variety to come out. So what really determines these numbers, and it's a lot of variation as you can see there, is the pipeline size. And in other words, how much is really coming out of these pipelines each and every year? Well, there's a lot more coming out of the grazing grain than, say, the pedigree selection pipeline. And then also year-to-year variation. And then, of course, there's going to be a little bit of indecision on my part. There you see the 2020 varieties. It took 3 to 9 years to make that decision to pull the trigger. And they all just came together at one time. And that's the biggest reason why we had 5 in 1 year. I feel like technology should be allowing us to bring this number down. And I think that's important. That we spend a little bit less time on the testing part. I'll tell you why in a minute. But ecology is working against us. We're dealing with these unusual events, such as the freeze of 18, the drought of 14, the stripe rust epidemic of 15 and somewhat 16, the drought again of 13, stripe rust again in 11 or 12, that is. So we want to make sure we see everything we can possibly see. And it takes time to do that, not so much locations, but time. Why is time important? Going back to this breeding cycle, population development, and line testing. The faster we can turn this, what's really called a wheel, the more distance we can cover in a given amount of time. And to a plant breeder, distance is genetic gain. So the faster we turn the wheel, the faster we make a cycle, the more genetic gain, assuming that our breeding is right, assuming we are efficient in our breeding process. And therefore, for an 8-year cycle, we're going to have a higher cumulative gain, genetic gain, than we would for a 12-year cycle. And that's why time is really important. Put that in as another way of describing it. With real examples, here we have Duster being the parent, one of the parents of Gallagher. We know we have the data now, 8% yield gain of Gallagher over Duster. That is 8+ years of variety trial testing. We know that. Smith's Gold, we're not quite as certain, but about a 5% yield gain over Gallagher. So that's genetic gain. We want to make these heroes as short as possible. Now, let's put that in the context of hardwood winter wheat breeding. This is not everything, but it's a good sample across 3 lineages, the Triumph, the Carl, and the Newton lineage that has been so prevalent in this program. Each one of these arrows represents a breeding cycle. So the time it took to go from Gallagher to Smith's Gold was not near as much as what it took to go from Nakoma to Chisholm. And so this breeding cycle has really been shortened, although we haven't really helped matters with our line testing, but we can get around that to some degree. I'll say that maybe for questions. Here is now taking that same chart, the change in grain yield over breeding cycles, starting with turkey, breeding cycle 0 up through breeding cycle 6. And by the way, we are well into breeding cycle 7 at this time, starting breeding cycle 8. And there is no doubt about it. There is a definite yield increase because I think we see it, for one. I see it in the field. but we can quantify it and show it a little bit more convincingly by putting yield as a function of breeding cycle as opposed to, say, year of release. Because like I said, some varieties it takes 3 years to test, others it takes 9. Well, that could be a 10-year difference in year of release, even though they may be out of the same breeding cycle. So we definitely have a yield increase, and that yield does not seem to be plateauing in Oklahoma. Just like anything else in life, we have opposing forces. We're trying to make rapid progress, and 3-year testing. I'd love to be able to get by with that. Just may not cover what I described as 1 and 5 year events, like the freeze events and stripe rust and whatever. Also, I strongly believe yield and quality do coexist. I think we've proven it to some degree with some of the varieties we've released, not necessarily all of them. If, and that's a big if, that they're adequately scrutinized. And I think that scrutiny is becoming more important now as we go into a clean label world. We really have to see what's in these varieties and what they can do in a clean label world. But I see it. I feel it myself, but I see it across the board. I think there is a definite rush to release, and I think we're cutting corners that on traits that we don't see. We don't see them in the field. Of course, we see yield, but we don't see quality. And I think it's easy, and I make this mistake myself. Well, can't see it, then that's somebody else's problem. Let them worry about it. But you know what? The industry is watching. The industry is definitely watching on what varieties are coming out. And this is just 2 examples. Shawnee Milling, you could put up a list that they have for preferred varieties. They know, they have a pretty good idea what they want, because the millers do, because they have customers shouting in their ears, saying this is what we need from the flower that you produce for us. So these are not just feel-good lists. These varieties are supposed to generate the grain streams that will service the customers these millers have to satisfy. So what are these customers asking for? Okay, it's not just protein. Protein's big, but they're asking for things like, when in the milling process, what kind of refinement do we have in the milling process? Can we maximize flower yield and minimize ash? Dose strength and accessibility, those are opposing forces to some degree, but you can possibly get those put together in the same package. All kinds of other things that influence what the customer really wants. Some other things over here, a little bit less known, but I guarantee you, I have had conversations with the customers of these millers who are asking about these properties, and they're looking at varieties that can provide these properties. And I think it's just a matter of time before we start talking about amylase, trypsin inhibitors. We're already talking about it in a research sense, but varieties that have less of that, less fructans, acrylamide levels related to asparagine resistant, all this stuff, is really playing out at one time. And of course, part of the reason is it's a label on a loaf of bread. Now we're going to see a little bit more simplicity in the labels. This is a pretty complex label for a whole wheat bread. The things you see in red, they're getting dropped out. These are the additives that help make up for the deficiencies that come through in our wheat varieties, whether they're dough conditioners or maybe just oxidizing agents, but dough conditioners are big. Gluten is not considered, believe it or not, adverse to a customer, in terms of a clean label. So you're going to see gluten, I think, for years to come, but you're going to see a little bit less of the red. I mentioned protein. Protein I consider to be the master switch to achieving functionality. So it directly affects these properties I'm showing in red. All right, that's a lot of quality going on right there. Protein controls and influences to a large degree those other properties. I don't know about how protein would impact these, so I just left them not red, but doesn't mean that it cannot. So protein is really important. And fortunately for us as breeders, we have the possibility to select for and reliably select for specific levels of protein. I think that can be consistent among varieties, especially at the extremes, whether it's at the low end or the high end. This just shows, this graph shows how protein can change in response to the level of protein in the environment, which of course is determined by fertilization, nitrogen supply for one. So we have the Gallagher, Duster, IVA response in protein. They're very, very different. Look how Duster, which is the parent of both progenies, Gallagher and IVA, is right in the middle. You've got Gallagher, which responds to increasing potential of protein, IVA, which does not. It stays about a half unit lower than the Duster, from an 8% protein environment to a 17% protein environment. In fact, if you really want to quantify it out, and this is really important to a miller, IVA needs a 12.7% protein just to reach that critical 12% level. So protein really, the environment has to be very favorable for IVA to reach that minimum, what we consider the target level of 12%. However, IVA can compensate with a more functional protein. That's not to say, though, that protein, if you have high protein, you've got all your problems solved, because without good functionality to begin with, a lot of protein is not really going to help. I want to show you really quick how protein amounts can influence functionality. And Dr. Brzezowski already showed you some mixographs, so you already know what these are. These are really EKGs on the dough. So we're looking at how the dough responds over time to mixing. We had the development of the dough to this point where it peaks out, and then we have breakdown of the dough after that point. And we want to see a strong dough that not a very long peak time, not a very short one, but we want to see that development or that breakdown minimize. So we have breakdown here with Joe and a white wheat that we were thinking about releasing. It was in the variety trials, but was no better than Joe. It just has no mixing tolerance, whereas Big Country definitely has mixing tolerance. But this is at the desirable level of 12% protein. So the nitrogen was satisfactory to at least to reach that 12% level. What if we get down to 10%? And I can tell you, we are looking, thanks to Dr. Arnall, who set up some experiments or a location for us to conduct experiments at a not so optimal nitrogen level. So we're looking at mixographs at a 10% level protein, and this is right at the floor where the miller is going to say, you know, we really don't want that wheat. 10% protein is not going to give us the functionality we need, even if it's a good functional protein like a baker's am. Look at 8%. We really get low. And you get to the point where, and this is why, you know, the industry screams, you don't even get dough development. We don't even get a peak on these mixographs at an 8.5 to 9.5% protein. And by the way, you know, that's wheat protein. So the flour protein is going to be 1.5% lower than that. So 7 to 8. That's just in a territory we don't want to be. Yeah, you still see the differences in strength. So the Big Country and Baker's Am really stands out compared to those white wheats. But you're not getting the functionality expressed that's in that variety at that low protein. So we're really trying to find varieties that can hit the 12%, even when nitrogen may be less available for whatever reason. So wrapping up, variety output here at OSU it's basically a function of the productivity of several pipelines. So if we're productive in the pipeline, you're going to hear a lot about variety decisions. I think it's important for you to know what pipeline generated a certain variety. It tells you a lot about the breeding of that variety, tells you about what that variety might do for a producer. I think the ultimate trade-off in variety development is confidence versus speed. We want speed, but we don't want to sacrifice confidence. We don't want disasters in the field or in the bakery. And these are constantly going at one another. As food labels become cleaner, I think quality becomes more sophisticated, and it becomes more tempting to cut the corners that we shouldn't be cutting. And I think the industry will start to separate those out. Know what's being cut and what's being tightened up. I see it already today, and I think it's just going to play out even more in the future. So I think we got through there, Brian, about 30 minutes.
Absolutely. All right. Do we have any questions directly for Dr. Carver? Then we'll move in for a couple minutes of the roundtable if there's anything.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Brett, I had a couple questions. I put them to you in the chat, but I'll I'll ask them now. So, how fast do you think that doubled haploid accelerates your breeding pipeline?
Well, I know based on the releases so far, and I think this is a pretty good approximation. We're chopping off 4 years.
Okay, and that's
Yeah.
good.
So if our average is 11, we're going to average about 7 years on a double haploid. I'll do everything I can to speed that up, because usually with a double haploid, as you know, you're trying to achieve a certain goal as fast as possible. And one of the goals we're trying to achieve right now is a coaxium type or oxygen genetic system or trait in our varieties, and double haploids gives us the best way to do that, at least in terms of speed. I'm not sure about competence, but yeah, 4 years.
Okay, thanks. Another one is I've been curious to ask you how important is aluminum toxicity or tolerance to aluminum toxicity in your program still?
Yeah, it's very important. I just can't seem to get away from it. I've tried to divorce that trait, and
I wish you would.
yeah, I just couldn't. I couldn't find a court hearing, and so we continue to do it. I relied quite a bit in the early days on hemotoxin staining, just to look at aluminum tolerance. You can do that in a laboratory. There are actually markers, of course, we can use to select for aluminum tolerance. That would have been the easy way out, but then I realized, we're missing the boat on how varieties respond. And I think Jim Johnson may be on this Zoom, but gosh, his thesis research from 25 years ago was really what woke me up to this. Is there's a lot more to acid soil tolerance than just aluminum. So we're back to screening, selecting at a low pH in the field to pick up on other things like phosphorus or just low pH response.
Is it more important for any particular area of Oklahoma or just in general?
Well, it used to be more important for a smaller area, but that area seems to have grown. I think Dr. Arnall may have a better idea of this, but I think we're talking about north central to a little bit west, certainly not the Panhandle, but over maybe towards Alva, as far as west as Alva, down to the southwest. But I used to think of it as more of a north central Oklahoma problem. That's not the case anymore.
Kansas border to Red River, we can find significant acid soils. I'm a fertility specialist, so I want to move away from the use of aluminum tolerance into using lime, because we have so many other aspects that low pH is creating. However, what I see is as we get more crop diversification, more soybean, more sorghum, more corn, we see more liming. So our soil acidity holds stronger in our continuous wheat, specifically the lower yielding continuous wheat, and those areas that have a lot of grazing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and to add to that, I think that's one of the reasons Gallagher was so much more popular than IBA. IBA did not have the low pH tolerance, and I don't think Gallagher's that great, but it has enough, I think, for most people to get by at a pH 5, at least on grain, maybe not on forage, but on grain. And I'm just amazed that happened.
So I'll pose one for Bill and Brett for you guys to kind of go back and forth. How do you balance, or do you even worry about the balance of durability and yield? Because often, I think about other crops and we have the workhorse versus the princess, or the workhorse versus a racehorse. Do you go for both, or do you try to strike a balance?
Bill, you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I think I can comment on that. I personally, it depends a lot on the breeder's approach and strategy. I mean, personally, I'd like the workhorse or this is let me just say, one of the things we think about when we think about hybrids in particular is one of the advantages is that they're going to perform at least adequately, if not better, year after year. So they're more consistent, more stable in their performance. And that's kind of what I go for as a breeder. I really want something that's going to at a high level, but be also consistent at that high level. I mean, I know, there'll be some years where something will be down as far as its yield is concerned anyway, but that's been my strategy and my approach, and that's what I like about hybrids. Or we think it's going to be more uniformly performing over years. So.
Yeah. Well, that really comes to bear in a hybrid system. You certainly don't want to be producing a hybrid wheat on a pH 4.5, and graze the heck out of it and never really reach that potential that's in that variety. I like to think of it, Brian, as resilience. This is what really motivated me to bring this grazing grain system on board. Is I felt like I had a better chance of breeding for resilience without losing that yield potential. I felt like I could cover both. That's what you want to do. You don't want to have to select for the high yield potential on one hand and try to breed in durability on the other. You really want it in the same package. However, that I must admit, that high yield potential is the big carrot, and so I've kind of brought in this pedigree selection pipeline to approach that a little bit more aggressively.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I don't know. I'm not seeing anything else coming in. Are there any